Chapter 15 is the last chapter on seniors and aging. In this chapter, we're going to a little bit more on the social aspects. Last chapter was more about the physical. This is more about your psychosocial. We'd like to think that all aging is successful, but not everybody ages successfully as far as their psychosocial, emotional aspect of their lives. And the biggest thing that we have to look at is what helps some people age in a more successful manner and some people age in a more depressive manner. So the biggest thing that we're looking at is continuity theory. And basically what we have to look at is that there is a balance between when life becomes feeling too unpredictable and when it becomes too predictable and we have a lot of boredom. The competent environmental press model is one to take a look at as we talk about aging. What we're talking about here is basically our competency. What is our upper limit of our ego strength? And ego strength is talking about our personality of strength, being able to accept something or change something. Our motor, our cognitive skills, where are we at? If we are basically pretty good, and we're not doing much, then we have too little press, meaning is that we're not sort of pressing them or demanding much from them. If they're not able to do it, then we have too much press. And in this case, we may have people who kind of give up. We have to find somewhere sort of that happy medium, you might want to say. And so what we talk about is the adaptation level that's right there in the middle. What we want to do is say that people who are basically in this area, they're going to need support. And so, as medical healthcare professionals, you're going to find a lot of people in that middle area, and they're looking for some support as far as physical, social, emotional. Whereas people who are in this area, basically, they're already performing at their maximum performance potential. They may not need as much. In fact, if anything, you might need to slow them down just a tad. But generally, they're okay in this area. The ones we have to worry about are the ones that are really pretty much in this area. They can either be not pushing themselves enough, or unfortunately, family thinks they're doing really good things for them and overtakes care of them. Generally, we don't have to worry too much about overtaking care of, but we do have to think about that when we start talking about nursing homes and assisted living facilities. What will happen is that depending on how our environmental presses are against us, we can become proactive. We're going to feel we have some control over what happens, and we're going to push forward, or unfortunately, we may become docile, in which we allow the situation to dictate what's going to happen. With docility, we generally find people will have a higher chance of becoming highly depressed. They tend to have more medical and mental health issues. So we're really watching for this as medical professionals. What Erickson says is that at this point, as we're getting toward our retirement or just after retirement, we're going to do a life review, which basically we're reflecting on what we've done and what we haven't done. That reflection doesn't always mean that things are good or bad, but we're basically judging what we think. Now, to have integrity, we have to have judged our life as being meaningful, productive. Basically, we have some self affirmation. So go back to Maslow, that we have sort of lived the life that we not just socially wanted, but that we spiritually wanted, that we behaviorally wanted in our morals. So there may be times in your life when you haven't lived quite up to your moral expectations, but perhaps you came around and changed some of that. If not, we tend to feel despair, a sense of meaningless, a sense that, why bother? Why were we here? What did we do? And what we really want to do is hopefully live our life so that we don't wind up in despair. Because if we wind up in despair, we'll again have a greater chance for depression and a senior life that we're not as happy with, you might want to say. So subjectivity well-being is this feeling that we get from certain evaluations. And I like this little chart that we have because it sort of tells you about the internal causes that will give you some well-being and the external causes that will give you well-being. Now, the internal causes are the ones that you yourself can control. Unfortunately, when you're dealing with somebody else, you can't control those internals. You can help them see them, you can, show them, but unless they tend to take that within themselves, then there's not much we can do on the outside. What we can do is work on the external causes. Basically, we can give them one of the big ones that we can do for seniors is the desirability society, basically giving them some opportunities for things. Now, one of the ones we've talked about a couple of times is resilience. And resilience is going to be a big one. Generally, we've seen that resilience has either shown or not shown up earlier in life. But in some cases, we can have people who have had a lot of resilience up until, closer to their much later point of life. They get to the point where they're like, I have fought enough, I have done this enough, I give up. And we do have to be careful of those individuals too, because when they give up, we also can find that that can affect their physical health as well as their social health. Retirement then can be both a positive and a negative aspect for many people. For many people, they define themselves based on their jobs. So if you ask somebody, tell me a little bit about yourself, generally in the first three or four things they tell you is what they do for a living. And when we give up what we do for a living, we often give up a lot of our self identity. Now, when we transition, we tend to find people transition one or two ways to retirement. There's the crisp and there's the blurred. Now, crisp basically says, I have sort of a cutoff date from work. I'm going to completely walk away. Now, crisp does not mean that we're upset with work, but basically we have created a second life for ourselves, you might say. Now, there are some crisps that basically say, I'm done, I'm over this, and they walk away. Neither one of these are good or bad. It's just two different ways to do it. So I always talk about a friend of mine who, when it came time for his retirement date, he had told, he was a professor at another university. He had told the university he was retiring, and unfortunately, it happened to be in the middle of the semester. Now, he told them at the beginning of the semester that he wasn't going to make it all the way through the semester, that he was retiring on his retirement date, but they gave him classes anyway. His retirement date comes 2 weeks ahead of time. He reminds them that he's not going to be there after that date. He's put in retirement. They're like, well, don't you want to work it out because you have these students? He's like, nope, told you this was it. On his last class, he said goodbye to all of his students that he had in the classroom. He walked to his office. He picked up a mug, and that was it, and went to his retirement party. And when I talked to him, I said, all you took was your mug. Didn't you want to take your books or your papers? And he said, no, that part of my life is over. Tomorrow I fly away. And he'd already made plans to go visit a cousin at the other coast. And he said, and when I come back, I've already made plans to do this and I'm going to do that. And I've already joined this and I've already done this. He basically needed to walk away. He needed that part of his life to be over. He said, because he could never slowly move away from that. It needed to be done, and he needed to have basically a second part to his life. Unlike my mother, who always says I can talk about this, she had the blurred one. So they gave her the opportunity to do they call it drop. And so she did. She had 5 years to prepare to no longer be employed as a college professor. And at the end of those 5 years, she then retired. However, the next semester, she came right back as an adjunct. And instead of teaching 5 classes, which full timers had to teach, she taught 4 classes. And the year after that, she taught 3 classes. And the year after that, she taught 2 classes. And then the year after that, she taught 1 class. And I swear she taught that 1 class just so she'd go have lunch with her friends. It took her really like 4 or 5 years to literally get retired. And in her case, she said it was just that she wasn't quite ready to give up that role in her life, and that it did allow her to take perhaps classes that she wanted to take to teach, work with specific students that she really wanted to. She didn't have to just take anything that was assigned to her. So she said it was rather enjoyable. It gave her something to do, you might want to say, every day when she got up. So adjusting to retirement isn't going to be a one step fits all as far as what people are looking for retirement and also what they do in order to gain that retirement. Now, social emotional selectivity is an interesting concept. And one of the things I want to do is really show you this chart down here because we know as seniors, we find different things than when we're adolescents or even middle age. So you're going to see this sort of heavier dash line right here, and this is linked to information seeking. So as we're younger, we can see that information seeking becomes very high, especially in our adolescence. We really find information seeking important. We need to know who we are, how do we develop ourselves, become that sense of identity. But then as we get older, our information seeking basically drops. As far as the importance, it doesn't mean they don't want information, but what we're talking about is that that's not the most important thing. In part, remember, crystal intelligence gets better as we get older. So we may not need to seek as much information because we have a lot of information. Whereas we see our social emotional line here, it changes a lot. And in adolescence, we tend to have our lowest time when we're emotionally regulated. We tend to be very volatile, you might want to say, because we're learning how to be an adult. We're learning what we can and can't do. But as we get older, that emotional regulation becomes much more important to us. And we also have a better aspect of being able to do that. So it's kind of interesting in that they flip flop, you might want to say, during your lifetime. Now, this middle line that you see, little teeny dashes right here, that basically is just sort of looking at an average of the two. So you can see here that in middle life is where the two basically come together. And so middle life is where we tend to see that we are at an emotional level that corresponds with our knowledge level. So for those of you who are in middle age, you're at a good point. But now you're going to begin to split a little bit. Unfortunately, when we talk about getting older, we have to talk about widowhood. The death of one's partner, no matter what age you are, is probably one of the most traumatic experiences any partner can have. Now, we bring it here because we're going to see far more widowhood, of course, in our senior years. But what we talk about as far as the emotional connection, it doesn't really matter if you're young, if you're middle age, or if you're older. The death of the partner is extremely traumatic for the living partner. Now, as far as seniors are concerned, we know that widowers recover much slower than widows. They have a harder time emotionally, you might want to say, getting over this. They also don't do as well, seniors, without having a partner. So you often find that widowers will remarry or connect with somebody very quickly, where widows, in part because there aren't as many partners, but also may have an ability to withstand things a little bit more for themselves. However, widows have financial concerns. And we are talking about the current generation and generations before. We might find some of these financial concerns not to be as strong as these new generations move forward, in part because if we think about our grandparents and we think about our parents, the likelihood of those women having had careers that paid for themselves or had financial compensations for themselves, quite often were not there. They were more stay at home or they had low level jobs that may or may not have even had pensions. They may not have saved money on their own. What we do know is that today's women are more likely to work, have more professional jobs, and are starting to make sure that they can financially take care of themselves. So this will change, hopefully, as we see lifetimes go through. But we still have to remember that in the population of America, at least, we will still find that women will be less likely to work outside the home than men. So again, women will be less likely to be able to secure an income for themselves than men will, and they'll be more dependent on the income that their partners bring in, and of course lose that quite often when the partner dies. And then there's great grandparenthood. Now, it's kind of fun to be a great grandparent. It says that there are more people today becoming great grandparents, especially women, because women are living to be older age. In part, this may seem not quite right because you might say, well, people are having kids older. That's sort of another generation in between the boomers and the Ys. They were the Xers. The Xers waited a long time to have kids, but the Ys are not waiting as long. In part, they saw that their parents or the Xers waited too long. Perhaps they started having trouble having kids or the issues of the ability to get pregnant. So we are finding that women are moving back being pregnant a little bit younger. We're beginning to see a lot more 25 and 26-year-olds who are professionals having babies. So with that, there's a greater chance that a great grandparent would become viable within a family. Now, it's kind of interesting because great grandparents quite often view themselves as having uh, roles within the family, especially with the next generation that's coming through. They think of themselves as a historian. They also see this as sort of a new role, something else for them to do, because quite often at this point, they've lost a lot of their role within the family. They may not be the cooks anymore, they're not the kin keepers anymore, they're not sort of pulling things together. They physically or mentally or even financially may not be able to do that. But what they can do is hold the grandchild. What they can do is influence some things. Perhaps they have enough money to buy things. It gives them basically this thought also that they're going to live on and that life continues even though they may not. But of course, as we get older, one of the things we have to look at is sort of this frailty that can come along. Now, the frailty is generally divided into two areas, ADLs and IADLs. ADLs are basically your self caring tasks that you see there in green, what they can and can't do for themselves. Where IADLs tend to be more on the compensation issue and intelligence. So, are they able to transport themselves anymore? Are they able to manage their finances anymore? Are they even able to communicate with somebody else anymore? What you can find is that the more docile that a person has become, the more likely they're going to want to give up some of those IADLs. Efforts too. Now, it doesn't mean they can't do it, but because they become docile or because they've become less proactive, they begin to just allow somebody else to do it for them. And they get sort of a sense of relief, you might want to say. We have to be careful and that we still communicate with them, that's still part of the decision making. But at the same point, if they are getting too stressed to be able to communicate with others because they're having slight memory issues or that they're getting too old to handle the bills that are coming in because things are changing, interestingly enough, a lot of seniors are having trouble because so much of this is going to online and they may or not even have internet. As we talked about in the last chapter, we have a lot of eye problems. So if all of a sudden my bank is going to online slips, you might want to say, or all online activities. Many companies now are only sending bills through emails, and those may become too stressful for our seniors to deal with. One, just using a computer because computers are not so easy to use, especially if your fingers are not working as well as you want them to, and trying to remember all the passwords. I have a hard enough time myself remembering my passwords, more or less, if I had any kind of a slight mental memory issue. So some cases we may find that they just don't have the mental capacity to take care of some of these IADLs, but it doesn't mean they shouldn't be involved with it. It may be that you have to have somebody within the family reading them their bills or printing them out and being able to bring them to them. They can still do their checks, they can still do their checkbooks, and you might say, checks, what's a check? Well, you see, that's what they're used to, so that's what they're going to want to write. It's kind of going to be interesting to see how our society adapts to the amount of boomers who are going to be seniors soon. Most of you know the difference between an assisted living facility and a nursing home. The biggest thing is of course providing medical care. Nursing homes will provide 24/7 medical care, and assisted do not provide 24/7 medical care. Now, it doesn't mean that assisted living facilities won't have some medical care. They may be able to do diabetics. They may be able to give out prescriptions, meaning that they make sure they're in line, certain things like this. But 24/7 medical care would not be available to them. For especially the nursing students, elder abuse is becoming a large part of the testing and knowledge base that you have to have. We don't go as much into it in this class, except for to say that there are 7 different types. So, begin to really make sure you understand that. You'll get a lot more coverage of this when you get into your nursing program. For those who are not in the nursing program, you may not realize that there are 7 different types. And one of the ones that quite often people kind of are surprised about is the financial, because people don't think much about that. And even the other one is abandonment. So abandonment basically means is that you've become the primary caregiver for this person, and basically you sort of walk away from that responsibility. They call them dump and run. They put them into a nursing home and they're never seen again, the people. So that is considered to be a type of abuse. As you can see below, the type of abuse that's most common is, of course, neglect, physical abuse, and financial abuse. Social Security is an interesting history about it. Now, we can see that it was made in 1935. That's when basically it gets created. The question comes is, why in 1935 did Roosevelt feel that we needed to have a savings account? And this is after the Great Depression. And many people starved and suffered greatly during the Great Depression. And the thought was is, if citizens have a responsibility to their country, does not the country have a responsibility to their citizens? And especially our older citizens who have put their entire lives into basically the system that we have here in the United States. So as such, the thought was is that there should be a system that is a society system to give you some security in your older um, life. And what they really wanted to do was to make sure that older adults who had worked their livelihoods in creating the United States would have enough money to have basic food and shelter. Now, when I say basic food and shelter, we are not talking about living the lifestyle that you have now. We're talking about basic food and shelter. What was felt was that somebody who had worked for 30 years or 35 years and should not worry about continuing to work until they literally died on the lines, which is what a lot of people did at that time. Or widows who, at you have to remember, they did not work and they were not eligible to get pensions quite often. Even if they did, when their husbands died, they got nothing. They would be thrown out of their houses. So this was supposed to give you just enough money to have a small place, very small, and to make sure that you weren't eating cat food, you might want to say. Unfortunately, today, people tend to think that this is their retirement. And again, it was never meant to be your primary retirement. Most financial experts will tell you is that you should be able to live without your Social Security money. You should save enough, you should invest enough so that your Social Security money is basically just a little extra money. In part because once you do retire, you're probably not putting any more money into those retirement accounts. And as we know, prices go up. So your Social Security money should be that amount of money that's taking care of inflation or something unusual that occurs. Most people don't save money and then say, I'm going to retire and oh, I've saved enough for my water heater that's going to break next month. No, you tend to think about paying your basic bills, housing, food, gas, things like this. So your Social Security money should be able to take care of the unusual, you might want to say. Now, how Social Security is paid is through your payroll taxes. You do put money in, but you have to have paid for at least 10 years before you're vetted. How you determine how much money you're going to get from Social Security is actually usually based on your last years of life, the last years of working, you might say. So it's always best to try to make as much money toward the end as you can because that's what they're going to use. Now, I cannot promise that that will still be the same tomorrow. Social Security does change. It used to be 65. And the reason 65 was picked not because people thought that that's how long people should work, but the truth was is that the most people died by the time they were 70. Our age of life back in 1935 was not much over 70. And so at that time, the average person who made it to 65, only lived another 5 years. So the thought was is that you'd put this money in and you'd have 5 years worth of money coming back out. And of course, in our last lecture, we learned that if you make it to 65, on average, people are going to live another 20 years. So that's 15 years longer than what the original program was designed for. And one reason that Social Security has been pushed back. It used to be 65, and now for most people it is 67. You can still retire a little earlier than that, but you may or may not receive Social Security benefits, or you may receive a lower Social Security benefit. Again, you should always be aware of what you do and don't get with Social Security, but this should not be your primary source of retirement money. Make sure that you save part of your money, even if it's $5 a week. You'd be surprised at how much money that will add up to if you put it into a decent account 30 years later. Medicare is how do we explain Medicare? Medicare is basically the same thing as Social Security. It was supposed to be a way to take care of people once they retired, in part because the United States system, at least as of making this videotape, is that you get your insurance through your employment. Until recently, before the Affordable Care Act came out, the only way you got health insurance was by being employed. Well, what happens when you retire? You're not employed anymore. So what type of medical coverage can you have then? Especially since most doctors and hospitals will not take you unless you're either fabulously wealthy or you have some sort of insurance. So the Medicare program was created to help fill that gap that tended to be there once people retired, because they no longer got health insurance through their employer. They only got health insurance now through the government because there weren't really individual plans. As we now know, the Affordable Care Act came in, and that allowed companies to create new types of health insurance and ones in which individuals could purchase them on their own. And there was lots of different talks about changing Medicare coverage and maybe even allowing people to buy into Medicare. Because as of right now, you don't buy into Medicare. Medicare is provided to you once you get to a retirement age. So lots of changing with this. However, you should understand the different parts, which you can see right there on the screen. And again, as we move forward through life, make sure that you are aware of those changes and what each person is desiring to do as you move forward. So this is the end of this lecture. We will see you soon, and the next chapter will be the last chapter in our course.